The little girl said, "She smells like Mama." The lonely single dad. Rancher couldn't let her go. Texas frontier. Winter of 1876. The wind howled across the plains like a wolf in mourning, carrying with it the smell of snow and wood smoke. In the lantern-lit hush of a small-town saloon, whispers circled like vultures over carrion. "Elias Monroe," they muttered, nursing whiskey glasses. "Man's been widowed near 3 years now. Still walks like a ghost across that ranch." Some said his heart had frozen with his wife's last breath. Others claimed the only thing keeping him tethered was the little girl with the wide, lonesome eyes. But the real stir began the day a stranger arrived, her boots caked with trail dust, her coat too thin for the cold, her scent of wild roses lingering in the air. It wasn't the men who noticed first. It was the child. From the church steps, small hands tugged at her father's coat sleeve. A whisper escaped trembling lips. "Papa, she smells like Mama." The saloon went silent. Outside, the bells tolled for Sunday service. But inside, every gaze burned with curiosity and hunger for what would come next. Could the scent of roses awaken the deadened heart of Elias Monroe? Or would the frontier winds tear away even this fragile chance at love? The frost clung stubbornly to the grass that morning, each blade bent under the weight of winter's breath. Elias Monroe rose before the sun, his boots crunching across the frozen dirt as he crossed the yard. The ranch was quiet, too quiet, the silence pressing down heavier than the sky. Horses shifted in the barn, their breath steaming, but no sound of laughter followed, no soft voice from the kitchen. Only the rasp of Elias's shovel breaking ice at the water trough. He moved with practiced motions, shoulders rigid, jaw set, as if routine alone could keep the emptiness at bay. Inside the house, the hearth smoldered weakly, wood burning down to pale ash. Grace's small chair sat pulled close to the fire, a doll resting against the leg, untouched since yesterday. Elias glanced at it once, then looked away, the ache behind his ribs threatening to undo him. By breakfast, Grace sat at the table swinging her legs, curls wild and eyes still clouded with sleep. Elias set down a plate of biscuits and ham, though his appetite was long gone. She whispered, "Papa, you forgot the jam," and smiled, a smile so much like her mother's that he had to turn toward the window. Beyond the frost-kissed glass stretched acres of empty pasture, and the hollow echo of her absence filled the space between father and daughter. Elias forced a low chuckle, slid the jar of jam across the table, and murmured, "Eat, little one." Grace obeyed, though her gaze lingered on him as though she carried a question she dared not ask. Later, when the work was done, Elias saddled his horse. Grace bundled in her wool coat and mittens. Together they rode into town for Sunday service. Bells tolled faintly, calling the faithful, and the streets stirred with wagons and boots crunching snow. Whispers trailed him as always, voices softened but never silenced. "That's Monroe." "Still grieving," some said. "Man walks with ghosts," muttered another. Elias kept his eyes fixed ahead, hat brim low, Grace's small hands gripping his sleeve. They entered the church, the scent of pine garlands and lamp oil mingling in the air. It was there, as the congregation settled into worn pews, that Grace tugged at his arm. Her eyes fixed on a woman slipping quietly through the doorway. She was slender, travel-worn, her coat patched at the elbows, but her bearing carried a quiet dignity. A scarf of faded rose-patterned fabric lay loose around her neck, and when the air shifted, the fragrance followed. Wild roses, faint but unmistakable. Grace's lips parted, her voice barely more than a breath. "Papa, she smells like Mama." Elias's chest tightened as though struck. He turned sharply, catching only a glimpse of the stranger as she slid into the last pew, her head bowed, hands folded. Through the sermon, Elias heard little. His mind tangled with memory, the scent rising like smoke from a long cold fire. He caught Grace staring more than once, eyes full of wonder, as if she'd seen a piece of heaven return to earth. When the final hymn ended, the congregation spilled into the cold morning. Snowflakes drifted down, settling on shawls and hats. Elias lifted Grace into his arms, his heart still rattling in its cage. The woman stepped from the shadows of the church porch, the rose scarf fluttering against the wind. Her gaze brushed his, steady yet cautious. Grace leaned forward, whispering again, "Papa," but Elias silenced her with a gentle squeeze. The townsfolk lingered, watching. Old Mrs. Pennington's voice carried sharp as a needle. "New face in town. Wonder what she's running from." Elias felt the weight of their curiosity pressing on him. The woman offered a polite nod, nothing more, before turning away down the snowy street. Elias stood rooted, Grace resting her head against his shoulder, her words echoing in his ears like a prayer he dared not speak aloud. The rose scent lingered on the wind long after she was gone, and for the first time in years, Elias's carefully guarded silence cracked. He tightened his hold on Grace, his eyes following the fading figure, a question burning quietly in the hollow of his heart. The boarding house smelled of soap and stew that morning, steam rising from the kitchen where Clara moved with quiet diligence. She had arrived only a week earlier, carrying little more than a satchel and that rose-scented scarf. No one knew where she'd come from, not truly, but her manner was steady, her smile reserved, and the matron soon found use for her capable hands. Townsfolk passed through daily, drovers, weary travelers, peddlers, and more than one paused to remark on her gentle way of tending to chores. Some offered polite greetings, others eyed her with suspicion, wondering what past might have driven her so far into the harsh heart of Texas. Whispers collected like dust in corners. "She's hiding something," one voice murmured. "Or maybe just looking for a husband," another replied. Clara heard, but she kept her head bowed and worked on. One crisp morning, the scent of frost still clinging to the air, Grace Monroe slipped from her father's side as Elias bartered for supplies at the mercantile. Her little boots pattered across the street, pigtails bouncing, until she reached the boarding house porch. There, Clara sat mending a sleeve, her needle catching the light. Grace held out a small wildflower, its petals slightly crushed from her eager grip. "For you," she whispered, cheeks flushed. Clara's eyes softened, her fingers brushing the child's as she accepted the gift. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, tucking the flower behind her ear. Grace giggled, the sound bubbling like a spring, and Clara's laughter joined, light and rare. Elias emerged moments later, his voice stern. "Grace," his daughter froze, guilt clouding her face. Elias's boots struck the boards as he approached, his gaze landing first on Clara, then on the wildflower. "She shouldn't trouble you," he muttered, his tone more shield than blade. Clara met his eyes, calm but firm. "Children don't trouble me, Mr. Monroe," she replied softly. "They only reach for warmth when they feel it." Grace clutched her father's coat, unsure, but Elias said nothing more. He tipped his hat stiffly, lifting his daughter back into his arms, though his glance lingered on the flower behind Clara's ear longer than he wished. That evening, after supper, the Monroe Ranch sat wrapped in quiet. Grace dozed near the fire, a doll clasped to her chest, while Elias sat at the table turning a scarf over in his hands. The rose-patterned fabric carried a faint fragrance that stirred his chest with unwelcome memory. He pressed it once to his face, then dropped it back to the wood as though it burned. The room seemed smaller with it near, as if ghosts had crept in alongside the scent. He stared into the dying embers, their glow flickering across the hollow planes of his face, torn between longing and guilt. Outside, coyotes yipped beneath the rising moon, the lonely sound echoing his own heart. In town, however, silence was scarce. At the saloon, words rolled between whiskey glasses. "Saw the widower's girl handing flowers to that stranger," one man said, leaning over the bar. Another smirked. "Looks like she's already found herself a new mama." The laughter was sharp, biting, and when the tale reached the ears of women at the church steps, it grew sharper still. "That woman'll tangle him up before spring," one whispered. "Mark my words." Some spoke with pity, others with envy, but all with interest. For nothing stirred a small town quicker than the scent of a story. Clara, meanwhile, remained at her post in the boarding house kitchen. Sleeves rolled, hands busy, yet when she closed her eyes, she could still feel Grace's tiny fingers pressing that flower into her palm. And when Elias lay restless in his bed, the faintest trace of roses lingered in his mind, blurring the line between memory and present, between love lost and the dangerous pull of what might be. Snow began to fall heavy and thick, swallowing the prairie in a curtain of white. The wind shrieked across the rooftops, rattling shutters and driving fine needles of ice beneath doorframes. At the boarding house, the lamps burned low, shadows wavering on the walls as travelers stamped their boots and gathered near the hearth. Clara moved swiftly between them, sleeves rolled, apron dusted with flour, her hand steady though her cheeks were flushed with heat and worry. Pots clattered on the stove, the smell of stew rising, rich and comforting against the storm's howl. She ladled bowls for ranch hands stranded in town, set bread upon the table, poured coffee with a patience that steadied frayed nerves. Even as whispers about her past lingered in corners, no one could deny the calm she carried, the quiet strength of someone who refused to falter when others leaned heavy upon her. The door burst open, snow sweeping across the floorboards. Elias Monroe staggered in, shoulders hunched, coat stiff with ice. His hat brim dripped meltwater, his lips drawn tight against the cold. Behind him, the wind tore like an angry beast before he shoved the door shut with a grunt. Clara turned, eyes widening at the sight of him. His gloves were stiff, his fingers trembling as he fought them off. Grace broke from her chair near the fire, racing across the room to cling to his leg. "Papa!" she cried, face pressed against him, relief trembling in her voice. He managed a nod, voice hoarse. "Cattle!" Had to cut him loose from the drifts. Near lost the whole herd. Clara stepped forward, steady despite the rising murmurs. "You'll freeze standing there. Sit by the fire." Elias shook his head, stubborn pride pushing against her words. But his knees wavered, and Clara was already moving, pulling a chair close to the hearth. She knelt beside him as he sank into it, unfastening his coat, her fingers brushing against his arms as she worked the stiff fabric free. Grace watched wide-eyed, then whispered against Clara's shoulder. Mama would have done the same. The words pierced through Elias's guard, sharp and tender all at once. He closed his eyes, chest heaving with a pain too familiar yet impossible to name. Clara fetched a basin, the water steaming, cloth draped across her hand. She lifted his raw, frost-bitten fingers gently, pressing warmth back into them. "Hold still," she said softly. Elias flinched, but her touch was firm, patient, neither intrusive nor hesitant. The fire cracked and spat, the scent of wood smoke filling the room. Around them, the other travelers quieted, watching the scene unfold as though some fragile truth balanced in the air. Elias dared not meet Clara's gaze, for in her calm he saw not pity but something deeper, something that tugged at the edges of the loneliness he'd sworn to protect. Night thickened, the storm battering the walls. The boarding house seemed smaller, wrapped tight against the roar outside. Grace drifted to sleep, curled beside Clara, her head resting on the woman's lap, her small breath steady as the fire's glow softened the room. Elias sat across, his eyes tracing the lines of Clara's face as lamplight caught in her hair. She spoke quietly, voice carrying the weight of her own solitude. "Storms come hard out here. You learn to endure them, or they take everything." He studied her, hearing not just words, but the echo of a life shaped by hardship, unspoken grief she did not yet share. For a moment, his own walls weakened, his silence less heavy, as though her presence drew the sting from the storm itself. But beyond the warmth of the hearth, tongues wagged. Old Mrs. Pennington, pressed near the doorway, whispered with sharp delight. "Look at her, tending him like a wife already." Another leaned close, chuckling low. "Widower won't be widowed long if she keeps on." The words spread as quickly as the fire's sparks, carried beyond the walls of the boarding house by eager lips. By dawn, the gossip would scatter through town like crows over carrion. Each retelling sharpened until it cut deep. Clara felt the weight of the stairs but kept her hands steady, smoothing Grace's hair, folding Elias's coat to dry. Elias, sensing the shift in the room, straightened, jaw clenched. Pride warred with gratitude, fear with longing. His heart thundered with the knowledge that every whispered word outside would soon find his ears. He had lived 3 years in silence, his grief his armor. Yet now, with Clara's steady hands and his daughter's trust binding them close, that armor cracked beneath the weight of something dangerously close to hope. The prairie softened beneath spring's touch, the snow retreating into thirsty earth, wildflowers pressing through soil as if eager to be reborn. Elias Munro stood at the edge of his fields, hat tilted low, the air filled with the calls of meadowlarks and the smell of damp grass. Renewal came in slow breaths, but suspicion still lingered in the town like smoke that refused to clear. When Clara Bennett arrived at the ranch with a stack of worn books under her arm, Elias told himself it was for Grace's sake alone. The little girl clapped her hands in delight, tugging Clara into the parlor, where dust motes swirled in sunbeams. Together they spread letters across the table, Grace's voice stumbling shyly through words, Clara's patient tone steady as a hand on the tiller guiding a boat through rough waters. Days turned into weeks, their rhythms shifting with the season. Elias mended fences while Clara and Grace planted seeds along the garden rows, their laughter carrying across the yard. At the end of a long afternoon, Clara tied back her hair, dusted soil from her skirts, and joined Grace in the kitchen. The smell of rising bread soon filled the house, warm and yeasty, curling into corners where silence had once reigned. Elias paused in the doorway, watching Clara lean over Grace to guide her small hands with the dough. For a fleeting instant, the ache in his chest eased, though it was followed quickly by guilt sharp as a spur. Each smile Clara drew from his daughter left Elias torn, as though every moment of joy betrayed the memory of the woman buried on the hill. The barn dance arrived with lanterns strung high and fiddles calling neighbors from miles around. The air shimmered with music and the scrape of boots across wooden planks. Clara's dress was simple, her cheeks touched pink by the glow of lamplight. A ranch hand approached her with a smile, offering his hand. She shook her head, polite but firm, her gaze flicking toward Elias at the edge of the crowd. Murmurs rose instantly, the whispers sharpening like knives. "She aims to trap the widower," someone hissed near the punch bowl. "Mark my words, she's setting her net." Elias heard, though he kept his jaw locked, his silence a shield that cut deeper than words. Clara's back straightened, her smile faltering as she withdrew into the shadows, the joy of the dance dimming around her. Later, as the night cooled and the music faded, Clara walked beside the wagon with Grace asleep in her arms. Elias lit a lantern, its glow painting his features in gold and shadow. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but no words came. Clara lowered her gaze, her voice soft, almost breaking. "You don't have to defend me, Elias, but your silence—" She shook her head, her grip tightening around the child. The lantern flickered, casting long lines across the dirt, and in that fragile moment, the air between them felt full of sparks, embers glowing, waiting for breath. Yet fear weighed heavier, holding both captive. Elias watched her climb into the wagon, the question unspoken on his tongue, whether love could rise from ashes, or whether ashes were all that would remain. The night was restless, the sky heavy with low clouds, the air pressing damp against the earth as if warning of trouble. Elias Munro lay half awake when the smell of smoke struck him sharp, bitter in the throat. He bolted upright, boots hitting the floor before thought could catch up. Outside, sparks licked at the dark, the barn glowing with the furious breath of fire. Horses screamed, hooves pounding inside the walls of flame. He shouted Grace's name, his heart stalling until he found her already on the porch, eyes wide with terror. Then came Clara, running past him, skirts gathered, her voice cutting through the chaos. "The pony! She's still inside!" Before Elias could catch her, she had thrown herself into the haze, disappearing into the crackle and roar. The fire snapped like a beast with no leash, devouring hay and timber. Elias plunged after her, choking on smoke, the heat searing his skin. He glimpsed her through the blaze, coughing but determined, tugging at the halter of Grace's small pony. The terrified animal reared, but Clara's voice held steady, coaxing, pleading. Elias fought his way through the choking dark, his hands gripping the reins with hers. Together they dragged the pony free, stumbling into the night air as flames clawed at the roof behind them. Grace screamed from the porch, relief and fear mingling in her cry. Elias pulled Clara close, steadying her as she swayed, the acrid scent of singed fabric and smoke clinging to her hair. Her knees gave way and she collapsed against him, her breath ragged. They laid her on the kitchen floor, the fire outside left to neighbors and buckets, the barn's timbers cracking as the night swallowed their labor. Elias pressed a damp cloth to Clara's brow, his fingers trembling despite years of steady ranch work. Grace knelt at her side, eyes brimming. "Papa," she whispered, voice small as a bird's song. "I don't want to lose her too." The words pierced through Elias like a blade twisted deep, breaking the walls he had built stone by stone around his grief. He cupped his daughter's face, his throat thick, unable to answer. All he could do was grip Clara's hand, feeling the faint pulse beneath her skin, and pray the night would give her back to them. Clara stirred before dawn, coughing weakly, her lashes fluttering as she woke to the glow of lantern light. Elias sat at her side, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. Their eyes met, the silence between them heavy with everything unspoken. Gratitude, fear, longing. "You shouldn't have risked it," he murmured, but his voice cracked. She smiled faintly, lips dry. "For Grace, I'd do it again." The words broke him, yet stitched him whole in the same breath. His hand lingered on hers, thumb brushing across her knuckles. For the first time in years, Elias allowed himself to feel the weight of a truth he could not deny. He needed her, though the world would not forgive so easily. By morning, smoke still drifted over the ruined barn. The town gathered quick, eager for tale and judgment. Some praised Clara's courage, but sharper voices cut deeper. "Reckless," they said. "She'll bring ruin with her wild ways." Rumors coiled tighter, fangs bared. They whispered of a past she must be hiding, a past that made her unfit to stand beside a man like Elias Monroe. Clara kept her chin high, though each word seemed to land like a stone in her chest. Elias heard them all, his jaw locked, his silence gnawing at him like guilt. The storm broke when a rider came from the east, dust and weariness on his face. But recognition sparking the moment he saw Clara. His voice rang across the yard, bitter with old betrayal. "Clara Bennett," he spat. "Thought you'd run far enough to escape what you left behind." The crowd hushed, breath caught. Clara's eyes widened, not with shame but with sorrow. "You lied," she said quietly. "You stole what wasn't yours and you blamed me to cover your tracks." The man sneered, but doubt rippled through the onlookers. Elias stood caught between the weight of gossip and the woman before him, who had risked her life for his child, who carried truth in her trembling voice. Grace clung to his hand, tugging, her whisper fierce. "Papa, believe her." Elias looked at Clara, her eyes raw with pleading, and in that moment, the reckoning lay bare. He could surrender to pride and fear, or he could step forward into the fire of gossip and stand with her. The silence stretched, heavier than the smoke that still hung in the air, and the choice carved itself deep in his soul. The weeks after the fire were marked by ash and renewal. Blackened earth gave way to seedlings, fences rose straight and sturdy again, and the rhythm of the ranch returned. Clara, though pale from her ordeal, moved with quiet determination, her hands never idle, kneading bread, tending Grace's lessons, mending what flame and rumor alike had torn. Laughter began to stir in the house once more. Grace skipped through the yard with her braids flying, coaxing smiles from her father. Elias, long hardened by grief, found himself laughing, haltingly at first, then freely, the sound startling even him. Still shadows lingered. The town's whispers had not ceased, and Clara knew the weight of their judgment might one day crush all she had begun to cherish. One evening, as the horizon blazed in streaks of gold and crimson, Clara saddled her mare in silence. She had packed little, just a shawl, a book of psalms, the scarf Grace had once tucked with wild roses. Her heart ached, but her resolve was firm. Leaving would protect them both from shame. The sound of small footsteps broke her thoughts. Grace stood at the gate, eyes wide, voice trembling. "Don't let her go, Papa." Elias stepped onto the porch, lantern light brushing his features soft. For a long moment he said nothing, only watching Clara with a weariness born of years. At last he descended the steps, his boots crunching gravel. You mean to leave without a word? Clara's hand tightened on the reins. The town will never accept me. I won't bring more burden to you or to her. Elias's jaw clenched. He looked at Grace, who clung to his leg, then back at Clara. His voice dropped, roughened by truth. It isn't the town I fear. It's myself. If I let you stay, if I let myself care for you, does that mean I forget her? His throat worked around the name he hadn't spoken aloud in months. Clara stepped closer, her eyes shining thou steady. Love doesn't erase, Elias, it multiplies. Your wife will always live in you, in grace. But you don't have to live only in sorrow. The lantern's glow flickered across their faces as silence fell, deep and fragile. Slowly, Elias lifted his hand, brushing back a loose strand of her hair. His fingers lingered, trembling. He drew in the faint scent of roses that still clung to her scarf, whispering hoarsely, "You smell like roses." Something within him broke and mended all at once. Clara's eyes softened, and for the first time, there was no fear between them, only recognition of what had been growing, unspoken, through storm and fire. They climbed the steps together, Grace tugging them both toward the porch swing. The three sat shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun bleed red and gold across the prairie sky. No words were needed. In that moment, grief found its rest, and love, hard-earned, scarred, yet enduring, claimed its place. The day ended as the prairie hushed, and a new family was born in the quiet strength of the setting sun.